I'm just so thrilled to be back with another knitting podcast. I think it's been about 2 months since I last did an episode, which means I have a lot of things to discuss with you, a lot of projects to show you, and it's going to be really fun. I'm going to keep you company for the next hour or so. Please grab yourself a drink, grab your knitting or crafting project, and let's get started. And as always, if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing so you don't miss my future videos. The first finished object I wanted to show you is my finished Flora Scarf. I'm really excited to see this one finished because this has been lingering on my needles since about August. Even though it's a pretty simple lace scarf with no kind of complicated steps involved, it's fully charted and has the same diamond repeat. I still heavily modified this because I used a smaller needle size to be able to use the yarn I envisioned this in. This is the Alpaca 2 from Isager. It's, I would say, a light fingering. It has 400 meters in 50 grams, so it's pretty thin. The original pattern asks for DK weight yarn and 3.75 needles. I instead used 2.5, and this pattern is fully charted, so once I reached the end of the increase chart, I just kind of kept going in the same sort of motif because at this point I had memorized it. But when I started decreasing, I noticed that I absolutely cannot decrease at the same rate as I was increasing. It looked really sloppy, and this diamond motif looked really kind of broken up and asymmetrical. And I showed this last time, and since then I did frog back and redo it again. But for that I had to really be more involved than in my first attempt. And I actually went to Stitch Fiddle and transferred the last couple of repeats of the original chart into Stitch Fiddle and tried to really accurately extend it. I actually had to purchase the premium version of Stitch Fiddle. They're not sponsoring me. I really wish they were, because it's like best €5 I've ever spent. It was so convenient to be able to just copy and paste parts of the chart and make sure that everything is really lined up with the original design. So once I was happy with the central width of this triangular scarf, I started decreasing, and it was really easy to do without any mistakes just because I again had everything charted, including my modifications. So I ran out of the chart around here and started doing my increases, and I made sure to go back and start decreasing at the point where this diamond is like fully formed to make sure that it's nice and symmetrical. And I actually really overestimated how much yarn I would have left over. I really didn't want to run out because I only had one ball of this yarn. Of course, in hindsight, knowing that I have like 15 grams of this yarn still left, I know I could have done more repeats and made the scarf a little bit larger, but at the same time I didn't want it to be too big because I think the beauty of this scarf is that it's really kind of elegant, small, and it definitely satisfied my like itch to knit something lacy and something super intricate on a small needle size. I just love how I put so much work into this and it still looks really small and really kind of minimal or something. I can't explain it. I really love the look of super intricate lace knit on smaller needles because I really do not have the time to knit any doilies in the foreseeable future. This felt, you know, like a nice substitute. I also really love this kind of pale olive color. I think it suits me really well. I'm not sure it works with my undertone, but just like aesthetically, I really like this color, and I think it's a great neutral without being beige or gray or grayish or white or anything like that. It's just a really pretty color. I think I will be on the lookout for it in some other yarns which I can use in the future for like a sweater or a cardigan, some kind of garment. And I also really enjoyed working with this alpaca too. So this is 50% wool and 50% alpaca, and it has a really slight halo on it. I think it's a really nice choice if you don't want to use mohair, but you want to have some nice like lace weight or light fingering weight yarn for, you know, some kind of an open lace project. I can't really comment on the scratchiness of this yarn because I haven't worn this scarf yet, but perhaps it will be scratchy, you know, because of the alpaca. Yeah, it's pretty scratchy, I would say. I don't really feel sensitive to the scratch. I don't find most yarns itchy. It's not really bothering me, but just, you know, it prickles a little bit when I put it next to my skin. So maybe it's not a good substitution to mohair in terms of being more soft than mohair, but in general, if you don't want to have something super fluffy but still want to have this little halo that like fills in the stitches, this would be a really nice option. And also you can probably tell that this was a really satisfying block. I absolutely adore blocking lace and seeing it come together, because of course when you're knitting it, it's all scrunched up and you can't really tell what's going on. You have to like really stretch it to be able to see the actual motif. Of course, this knit is not really seasonally appropriate anymore because we got our first snow yesterday, a really generous amount of snow. It's really white outside, and of course I need something less breezy to be around my neck. Of course, this project wasn't really successful in terms of making a dent in my stash. 30 grams is basically nothing when I still have like 7 kilos of yarn. You know, not super happy about that, but the next finished object I want to talk about is much more successful in terms of how much yarn I was able to use from stash. So this is my finished Lovisa cardigan, and I just love this one. I adore how it came out. I adore this color, and it was also such a delightful knitting experience. This was a really quick knit. I finished it, I think, in about 2 to 3 weeks at most, and I know that knitting is not about speed, but it still felt really nice to have a really beautiful garment so quickly. And it also, as I said, made quite a dent in my stash. I used about 450 grams of old, very old stash yarn for this. I wasn't able to use up all of it, but it's mostly because I, again, overestimated how much yarn I would need, especially for the button band and for the collar. So I used a combo of yarns, both of which are pretty obscure and I'm pretty sure are discontinued at this point, but it was 6 strands of this thread weight merino, which is usually something you can find on a cone and something I discussed a lot in previous episodes. And I also held 1 strand of this mink cashmere together with it. This is a really questionable Chinese mink cashmere, which is all natural fibers, at least by just like the burn test. It doesn't melt, it just burns like a natural fiber, but it's something that I would not buy again, at least directly from the shop, because it's mostly available on places like Temu or AliExpress, and it just rubs me the wrong way to buy yarns from those places. I do have some mixed feelings about this yarn after I already used it in the garment and wore it. I'm quite disappointed in this combo, but I'll get into that. This design has a really fun sleeve construction, or like shoulder construction. It's similar to contiguous or like mock saddle shoulder. I'm not really sure what it's called. I'm always confused with this sort of shaping, but I still really love it. I think it's so flattering, and at least for me, it fits me really well. I'm glad I chose this pattern for a simple stockinette cardigan instead of something that is knit in a regular like drop shoulder or raglan. You start by casting on stitches for both of the fronts and also for the back with these like ribbed details on the shoulder, and then after you're done with the short row shaping, you start to increase for the shoulder or like sleeve stitches here, and then it kind of merges into this pretty simple raglan, so it's really easy to follow. And there's also a sweater version of the Lovisa cardigan and another pattern which is really similar but doesn't have this like ribbing detail. It's like seamlessly integrated into stockinette. It's called Matcha Sweater from Vert Knit, and it describes its shoulder shaping as seamless saddle shoulders, so perhaps it's the correct term for it. I made just 2 modifications to this cardigan, and one of them was because of my mistake. So I actually misread the instructions for the buttonholes and knit 1 extra buttonhole, which I was not supposed to do. So for some reason, I thought that you have 2 buttonholes close together, both on the collar here and at the beginning of the button band on the body, but when I attached my buttons, it just looked really goofy and like something was wrong, because these big buttons were really like close together, and compared to them, the other ones looked really far apart. I first thought that the instructions were wrong, but then when I reread the instructions, I realized that it was me who made a mistake, and I kind of divided them incorrectly. So before committing to like unpicking the collar and the button band just to redo it correctly, I decided to go on Farfetch to just look at different fancy cardigans and see how the buttonholes are placed, and I noticed that on a lot of them the collar itself doesn't have a button and it starts just on the button band. So I, cut off the button from this place right here and everything fell into place immediately. I really like the buttons I chose, but when I first attached them, I attached them really loosely and they were like drooping when the cardigan was unbuttoned, which is kind of my pet peeve when it comes to buttons on knitted cardigans. It makes the garment look homemade and like something is wrong and they're like about to fall off. So because these buttons are gold or like metal and they're pretty heavy, when I first attached them they started to droop the fabric down. I thought maybe I need to just rethink my button choice entirely, but then I decided before I go back to the button haberdashery store and pick another ones, I would try and attach them really securely and like make sure that they're kind of wedged in between the stitches and lay really flat on the button band itself. In general, I don't know, I have so many positive memories surrounding this knit. I mostly worked on it when my mom came to visit. We had so much fun exploring different parks and cafes and like cool places around Lviv, some museums. Everywhere we went, I took my Lovisa cardigan with me. I feel like it's filled with all of the positive memories surrounding my mom's visit. The only downside of this otherwise perfect cardigan is that it unfortunately pills like crazy because of this cashmere, I presume. It's such a shame. I don't know if you can really see it on camera. It's really visible in real life. Like every time you get any like friction in the underarms, it creates this layer of tiny pills, which is really easy to get rid of, but at the same time it's really annoying and it takes away from the otherwise kind of fancy and classy put together look of this cardigan. So it's a shame that I have to depill it, and I'm just afraid that at some point I will start to damage the fabric, but it doesn't prevent me from wearing this in any way. I love wearing this cardigan and overall my favorite knit of this fall. And the next finished object I wanted to show you is really similar. It's also a cardigan, but I'm much more disappointed in how it came out compared to the Lovisa cardigan. So this is my finished Maggie cardigan, and of course I'm very proud of myself for pushing through with this one despite the small needle size, despite the really thin yarn I used, and also the fact that my row gauge was much smaller than the pattern intends for, so I had to just knit this for longer. I fully expected this knit to take me like 6 months to get through and only have it finished by like next summer, but instead it was a really convenient, mindless project to have, and I'll get to why, but I don't know, I'm still not entirely happy with it. I'm not really sure if it's my subjective like feelings towards it or if it really didn't come out great. I'll try and explain my reasons, but I'll start with the positives, and the first thing I really love about it is the yarn I used. So I used this really fun cone yarn which I picked up at my local yarn store during the summer, and it's this graphite colored spiral spun cashmere. It's 70% cashmere and 30% nylon, so it's a little bit stretchy and more sturdy than just cashmere on its own. Initially I picked it up to use in a different pattern with another yarn held together, but I changed my mind and decided to use it on its own because I just, out of curiosity, made a swatch. It looked really nice, especially after blocking. This cashmere just bloomed and opened up so well. I was just so excited to use it on its own in a small gauge project, and the Maggie cardigan was perfect for it, especially since I wanted to make it for a long time. And working with this yarn is quite a challenge because the nylon is much more stretchy than cashmere, and at some point you get this like, not really a knot, but like bunching of the cashmere on the nylon strand because it's so much stretchier and it like, you know, knits up quicker. But otherwise I really enjoyed working with it. I love this kind of slightly tweedy, heathery color. It's not really a gray, it's not really a black, it's really dimensional and interesting. So I guess it's a good thing that I have a ton of it left over. I originally had 300 grams and I only used about 140 grams for the cardigan, which makes it really lightweight and really drapey and nice, but terrible in terms of stash busting and like the stash busting yield it gave me because I was knitting it for quite a long time and I still, you know, have more where that came from. But the other thing I really love about this cardigan is, of course, the Maggie pattern itself. I think it's such a well-written pattern and such a nicely fitting design. It's popular for a reason. I'm not really like involved in this like petite knit discussion. I'm just trying to really chill and let myself enjoy the patterns I like, no matter if they're popular or obscure or overdone or viral or whatever. I'm just going with my own feelings, and I really loved the Maggie cardigan pattern. And the reasons I'm a bit disappointed in this cardigan is, first of all, as I said, because I used so little yarn to make this and it was such a waste of time in terms of stash busting, but also I just don't like the fit on me. I really expected it to come out differently, and it's unfortunately way too long in the torso. Because the fabric is so light, it really bunches up at my waist and it's pretty much unusable when it's buttoned up. It just looks bad on me. I also didn't do my regular modification of adding extra short rows on the back to make it longer than the front right before I started knitting the ribbing. I usually do that in addition to the shaping provided in a like given pattern, but here I just thought because the rows took me so long, I can just, you know, get away without doing it, but I really regret that. As soon as I start wearing this cardigan buttoned up and just move around a little bit and it kind of adjusts to my body, it starts to jump up at the back compared to the front, which is like drooping down because of the heaviness of the buttons and the lightness of the fabric. And this issue is something I can theoretically fix by just cutting into the yarn and just like unraveling for a little bit and adding short rows in, but I just know I'm not going to do it because I'm so busy with the other things I have on my needles and I have so little time to work on them. So unpicking my already finished Maggie cardigan and fiddling with it is not something I'm even remotely interested in, so I guess I'll have to live with it or at least wear it unbuttoned. I also can technically go back and unravel the stitches at the body and make it a little bit shorter, but the thing is, the other thing I really disliked about this project is that this yarn, even though it's a wonderful yarn and I really loved working with it, it's horrible on ribbing. I think it's always a risk with funky yarns like this that they will not look nice in ribbing or like hold ribbing nicely. So here it just was really loose, even though I used a smaller needle size. I knit the main fabric on 3mm needles and I went down to 2. When I bound off the button band initially, it was quite loose and I knew that it would look even looser once I block it. So I decided to go around it with a crochet hook. So I ended up going around this button band with the smallest crochet hook I have and doing single crochets. I used 1.25mm hook, which honestly, I have no idea why I even have it, probably because the universe knew that I would have to do such a, you know, brain cell reducing activity. I think it took me about 5 or 6 hours to go around this button band, then around the collar, and then, you know, go back to the other side of the button band. It was miserable. Because of that, there is no way I'm cutting into this edge and redoing it again. My only 2 options with this cardigan to be able to make it more wearable is, first, I can try and block it again and make sure it's really blocked into shape. So just make it wider and, you know, shorter, but I'm not really sure it's gonna work. And the other option is just to always wear it unbuttoned, which is not what I originally intended, because for me the Maggie cardigan is more of a buttoned t-shirt, and because I have so much yarn left over, I'm thinking I can maybe somewhere along the line make a sleeveless top to go with it to kind of make it into a twin set. And I like the really vintage nature of this cardigan. I also used vintage buttons here. They're easily my favorite thing about this cardigan. I'm really happy that I managed to find a place for these vintage buttons I had in my stash. I love this really iridescent sheen, this like mother of pearl sheen they have around the gold center, so they really complement this fabric, I think, and make it more elevated and like vintage looking, but still I think I messed up the placement of these buttonholes for sure. These 2 are much closer together than they need to be, as well as these ones at the top, but it's also something I'm not going to redo in any way because this border is just locked in. I kind of attached the buttons haphazardly just so I can block this. I usually baste the button band when I block cardigans, so the button band is not super stretched out. I will probably reattach these buttons and make sure they are placed in a more kind of convenient spot to really hide the mistakes in the buttonholes. But I don't know, they're still really heavy for this cashmere, even though it's like a, you know, plastic super light button, just because this cashmere is so drapey. This is not warm at all. It might be a perfect like summer cardigan, but definitely not warm for this sort of weather that we're having, which is like, you know, white Christmas weather. But I feel like I will grow to love this one over time. It was just a bit of a disappointment because I kind of imagined this project differently, but I also was mostly working on it for like practical reasons. So after I finished my Lovisa cardigan, all of my other whips at the time were in a state where I really had to think about them and be really focused on them while I'm knitting, and it just wasn't something I was able to do because back in October I had some really unwelcome and sudden changes at my day job, and without getting into too much detail, I just found myself to be in a really stressful new work situation with a much longer schedule and a lot more like requirements. It was really frustrating, and it still is, but I feel like I have no choice but to just accept the changes or like reassignment to a different project, because otherwise I'm at a risk of being laid off completely, and I was like communicated that already. So even though it's less money, more of my time, more stress, I just don't feel like I have it in me to try and navigate the job market in like, you know, wartime Ukraine. And it gets really complicated, but I at the same time know that I'm just way too tired from working in corporate and like IT and logistics related jobs for years. And because I mostly worked with US-based companies, it was a lot of night shifts and working with an American schedule, which in Ukraine, if I work a standard American 9 to 5, I start at 5 and finish at like 2 or 3 a.m. So I really don't want to continue down that road, especially knowing that there are pretty much no career prospects. So I have been finding myself very like drained, and I've also always been really aggressively protective of my work-life balance and always try to make sure that work comes second and life comes first, that I always have time for my hobbies, for my knitting and stuff like, I don't know, creating a personal curriculum and making sure I always learn and like grow as a person, do something interesting and form memories along the way instead of, you know, just being in this routine of a corporate job and like terrible news and everything else that can make a person feel miserable just, you know, as soon as they wake up. So this new job really took me by surprise and like caught me off guard. And while I was still adjusting to it and trying to see if I can get used to this new schedule, I wasn't really knitting or doing anything much really. I don't know, it really made me think that perhaps I want to do this full time, but of course I'm not there yet, and I feel like I need to be a responsible adult and take this job more seriously, but I've been really struggling to adjust. And the only thing, coming back to knitting, which I was able to knit during that period was my Maggie cardigan, just because the rows were endless. And I feel like my kind of negativity surrounding that project is because I was only able to work on it throughout end of October / beginning of November. I was just counting on it to be a successful project, something I can like tick off my knitting plans, but instead I tried it on after it was finished and after putting so much work into it, and saw that it came out looking meh, and it really bummed me out even more. And since I finished the Maggie cardigan, my schedule became a little bit more manageable just because I'm finished with my training, but I still find myself with a lot less free time to knit. So while I was able to get into my other works in progress, I feel like I'm still a little bit behind because everything I planned, I kind of planned as a different person who had much more free time and like leeway to work on knitting. So yeah, I'm still getting used to this, and I don't know, I think this tweet sums it up best. This next finished object is something I've made entirely for practical reasons. I just made a new hat to go with my Berlin scarf, which I finished last year. This Berlin scarf is by far my most worn winter accessory, and I'm so happy I made it and pushed through the endless rounds of stockinette and these really frustrating I-cords I did. I also made a hat to go with it initially to have a set, but that hat was kind of too big for me. I noticed that after a while it really drags down to my eyebrows and frames my glasses in a really goofy way, so I bought more of the same yarn to remake the hat. And you might say that buying more yarn was unnecessary because I could have just frogged the original hat, but this was not an option with this yarn because it's impossible to frog. So this is an Italian kind of factory yarn called Tobias, and it's available in a couple of different brands. I bought it from our Ukrainian yarn store that carries it, and it's basically this super loose alpaca fluff on a viscose strand with these like viscose bits of tweed or like, you know, little bubbles throughout, and it looks really cool. It looks really nice when it's knit up, but it has no stitch definition and the fibers really tangle into each other, and frogging it is not an option. So I managed to find the same yarn in the same dye lot, and I bought it, I don't remember when, but probably either in spring or in the summer, and I just kind of kept it around because I knew that at some point I will sit down and make another simple ribbed hat to go with the scarf, and I finally got around to doing that. I didn't use any sort of pattern for this. It's just a standard tube of ribbing with rapid decreases at the crown where you just loop the remaining stitches into this circle and just weave in your ends, which I think is a standard thing to do for a hat. I of course made it smaller than the previous version and also added an elastic strand so it holds its shape a little bit better, and it fits me perfectly. I'm really happy with this really simple finished object, and even though I bought 2 balls of this yarn and was holding it double, I still have some left over, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I don't think I will buy this yarn again in the future or like in the foreseeable future. I enjoyed working with it, but I just don't see any projects I would be interested in to make with this yarn. So I love wearing my Berlin scarf, and I also feel a lot more kind of put together when I have a scarf and a hat knit in the same yarn and have them be a set instead of this like random array of knitted accessories. So really happy with this project. And the last finished object I wanted to show you before we move on to works in progress is only technically a finished object because I will be going back and modifying it a little bit. And this is my Holy Bandana. This is a pattern from Suzanne Miller. This is actually a gift knit, and I can't wait to give it to the recipient. And even though I love how it came out a little bit too small. I've knit the amount of repeats described in the pattern, but even though my gauge is kind of close to the original, I didn't really check it that much because usually I'm not really fussed about my gauge when I'm knitting small scarves or little shawls like this. I was really hoping that with blocking it will open up more, but unfortunately it didn't, so I will have to go back and unpick this I-cord and, you know, add more repeats to this. I do have more yarn to finish this, so it won't be an issue, but it's just something I've been putting off because, again, with the little amount of time I have, having to like take a step back and unpick a finished object feels like such a frustrating experience. The yarn I used for this is also an old stash yarn. This is a leftover burette or raw silk which I had from a bigger project, and originally it was this really simple beige color similar to the color of my couch, but one of our dyers here in Ukraine agreed to dye it for me, mostly as an experiment. She didn't know how her dyes will react or show on this raw silk, so she warned me that we might have to bend this yarn or it might bleed after blocking, but none of that happened, thankfully. I really love the color of this yarn. It's this super nice bright auburn. This yarn also has an amazing drape to it, and it's just so beautiful to look at. It's super soft, and I also really love how these little lace flowers opened up with blocking, so all I need now is just an evening without any other project in my way where I can just unpick this I-cord and add more repeats, and then I will be all set to gift this one, and I just can't wait. Well, I think it's fair to say that we're entering the dark ages of Andolini knits because I had to take out my ring light for the first time since I bought it like a year ago. I've never had to use it before for filming, and it's still pretty dark, so you'll have to bear with me. And I also think it's really ironic that the first work in progress I wanted to show you is a black sweater. So I've been knitting my Rosie sweater since September, and unfortunately I'm not even close to being done. As you can see, it's still about halfway through, if not less, but I still feel like I've made quite a lot of progress with this one, especially when it comes to creative decisions and modifications I've made. I really love how it's coming out so far. Of course, this pattern needs no introduction. It's been really viral, which actually makes me really happy to see people discovering Lana. I think she deserves all of the hype she gets now, and her patterns are really beautiful and really well written. At least in my experience, I've really enjoyed them, and she's one of my favorite designers. But for my Rosie sweater, I decided I still wanted to do quite a few modifications, and the first one you can see is, of course, the collar. The thing is, as I discussed last time, I accidentally started knitting this on larger needles than intended. It actually intends for 4.5mm needles to be used just for the collar work, but I misread that, and instead I'm knitting the whole thing on 4.5. It wasn't really an issue until I started to make the neckline. Because my gauge was so much bigger, the actual hole for the neckline was larger, and when I finished the mock neck, it sat way too wide on me, and I just didn't like how it looked. So I thought that the easiest way to fix it would be to just go with the same modification I've made for the Harriet sweater, which has a really similar construction and design features to the Rosie sweater. So when I was knitting that sweater, I changed the original mock neck into a folded collar with a double knit edging, and I really loved how it came out, but it was also my first time trying to do this double knit edge, and I was kind of improvising, so it didn't really come out too neatly. And on this one, because I had some experience already, I was able to do it really crisply, if I can say so myself. I'm really not sure you can see anything with this absolutely diabolical lighting, but I think in real life it adds a lot of textural interest and looks really dimensional. Also, one of the yarns I used in this yarn combo for the main collar has a metallic strand. It kind of glistens slightly, so I just really love this effect, and I think it looks really polished and professional. And since I added the pictures of this finished collar to Ravelry and to my Instagram, I had couple of people ask me to explain in detail how I did this modification, and I'm gonna try and explain. I actually think it's really simple. So basically all you need to do is to pick up the amount of stitches the pattern intends for your size for the collar, but do it in a smaller needle size. So for example, I used 3.5 for my ribbing on the collar, but I went down to 2mm needles. And once the stitches are picked up for the first round, you knit one and yarn over until the end of the round, so you have twice the amount of stitches you picked up. And starting with the next round, you continue in double knitting until you're happy with the height of your double knit border. And double knitting is, of course, knit one and slip one with the yarn in front until the end of the round, and on the next round you alternate the stitches you knit and stitches you slip. And there are so many tutorials online on how to do double knitting. I'm gonna try and find a good one and link it below. You continue in double knitting until you're happy with the height of your border, and in my case it was 10 rounds of double knitting, and it took me quite a long time. I think I watched the whole movie The Fighter in that period of time, and I wasn't really, looking at the movie. I was looking at my double knit border, so I'm probably gonna have to watch it again. But the parts I did see with my own eyes, I really liked. So what I'm trying to say is that this modification is quite fiddly. Of course, you have twice the amount of stitches, and since it's double knitting, you basically have to knit every round twice, but I think it's so worth it. And again, once you're happy with the height, you need to switch back to your original needle and to your original stitch count. So you knit a round of knit two togethers with your bigger needle, and after that you just continue in ribbing or 2x2 ribbing or whatever you want for your collar to be, and then you fold it as usual. I, for example, don't use a 3-needle bind off. I find it to be, again, too fiddly, so I instead just cast off in long tail cast off and actually sew my edge together on the wrong side, and I find that it looks pretty neat. Let me try and show you if, again, this lighting will allow me. Yeah, I don't think you can see anything. It's so dumb. I'm so sorry, but basically, in my case, I attached the collar right before my double knit border. I've knit this collar pretty early on just because I wanted to see if it would work out with the gauge I have. I was worried that the hole would be way too big, and of course it was for the mock neck, so I'm really glad that this modification worked out. And it also really helps with motivation on like a more involved project like this, to see it slowly come together and kind of loading from the top down. But if I'm being really honest, the other another reason I knit the color so early on is because I wanted to switch to something with no color work. I was so sick of knitting the color work at that point. I found it to be so tedious because, of course, it's a contiguous sleeve construction. At that point, I still haven't divided for body and sleeves, which meant that I had to knit all of the colorwork motifs at the same time for both the front, the back, and both of the sleeves, and do increases, like raglan increases at the same time, and it was just bunching on my needles and my yarns were tangling together. Also, I just couldn't wrap my head around this colorwork motif. I know it's not that complicated, and again, it's only one color. The floats are not that bad, at least on most of the rows, but it was just really, really hard for me to focus on the colorwork motif. Also, of course, knowing that at that point I was only on the first rows out of like 4 didn't really help. I really tried to push through, and seeing the color finished really helped me with that. It really motivated me to keep going. Even though this knit is not finished yet, I'm still really amazed to realize how much time I've already invested into this one, and it doesn't feel like much, but I think, again, movie math kind of helps with this because, for example, after I've split for body and sleeves, I had to still do a couple of rounds of the colorwork motif, so this rose right here, and it took me the whole of Lawrence of Arabia, which you might know is 4 hours long and not a quick knit by any means, but I was actually really excited to just continue in stockinette for, as far as I remember, the pattern says like 19 rounds of stockinette after you finish the colorwork motif. But after I've done a couple of rounds, I realized that I'm not really thrilled about having this large panel of no colorwork in the middle. I didn't really think about it when I looked at the designs because probably the beautiful rose colorwork motif was distracting me from that, but I don't know, it looks really empty to me. I'm not saying the pattern is bad, it's still really beautiful, and I've seen so many beautiful versions of this knit, but I just wasn't really feeling it, so I knew I wanted to modify it in some way to have the panels closer together, but not right next to each other, like one after another, because in my opinion that would have been way too busy because this rose motif is so intricate and has a lot going on. I think it needs to have some separation. So I figured that the best way to divide these two rose panels but still keep them pretty close together would be to add another thin colorwork motif in between them. It was a bit of a challenge to come up with the right motif because, for example, since this rose border is really graphic, I couldn't use anything that is too symmetrical or geometric. It would have just clashed stylistically with the rose motif. Also, I was already deep in playing this really intense and like clenching game of yarn chicken because I have very little left of my contrast color. So I had to come up with a border that was really thin and used just as little rounds in its width as possible. So in the end, I came up with this really simple and thin ribbon motif just by doodling, and I think it matches this pattern so well stylistically. It doesn't clash with the rose motif, which is all I wanted, and it also didn't use a lot of yarn, so I decided to kind of top it all off. I would also mirror my second rose motif, and I only finished it on one of the sleeves. Yet it's also really fun to know that my Rosie sweater would be quite unique and reflect my style more. I'm not really like against knitting the same thing as everybody else, but here the central like panel of stockinette was really bothering me, so I'm just really happy I figured it out. It took me like 2 days of trial and error and looking through different charts and like drawing the charts, sometimes, you know, starting to actually knit what I had in mind and realizing that it doesn't work with the yarns I have or the amount of yarn I have, or just doesn't match the pattern. So it was a lot of creative decisions that I had to go through, but I'm really, really happy with how it's coming out now. Well, guess I had to wrap up filming once again for the day because the lighting just got unbelievably dark. Nothing, not even my ring lights or overhead lights or post-production could save it. Yesterday, I didn't have time to show you the yarns I'm using for this sweater, and I discussed it in more detail in the previous episode, but just to quickly recap, I'm using 3 strands held together for each of the colors, and for my main color, I'm using Knitting for Olive Merino in the shade Licorice. It's just their black shade, and I'm holding it together with two mohairs, and the first one is this really fun metallic one from Lana Gatto. It's called Silk Mohair Luxe, and I've used it before and I really love it, but I think it works best when you add another strand of silk mohair to it, because it kind of blends the metallic shine a little bit more and it looks much more elegant and not as like out there and sometimes tacky. So that's what I would recommend. For this combo, to blend it together more, I added a strand of this Kid Royal from Alize. It's a nylon mohair blend. It's thinner than silk mohairs. I also mentioned it before, and I think it's really nice to just add a little bit of bulk and halo to your projects, and it's also quite affordable. And for my contrast color, I'm also using a silk mohair from Lana Gatto, but without the metallic strand, and also a strand of Kid Royal, but in this cream shade. The main yarn I'm using is Retrosaria Mondim, and I'm dangerously low on this yarn. I only have 15 grams left, and even though it's a fingering weight sock yarn, I'm still not sure I will be able to stretch it into two of the rose motifs I have left. So one on the other sleeve and another bigger one on the body. I'm just not sure I will have enough to do that, but I think I would probably buy a different sock yarn in the same kind of cream shade, because I'm hoping that once it's blended together with the two silk mohairs I'm using, it would be not that noticeable, because I can't really get my hands on more Mondim, or like I can technically, but I'm not really sure how long it's going to take for it to get here from Portugal to Ukraine, especially with the holidays coming up. It's probably going to be delayed, and I just don't want to stall my Rosie sweater for so long. I want it to be finished as soon as possible. And the reason I have so little of this Mondim left is entirely my fault. I just carelessly used it in a different project. So back when my mom was here, I started a really simple crochet project, mostly for fun, because I'm quite bad at crochet. I can't for the life of me follow a crochet pattern or crochet flat for that matter. I only know how to do granny squares, and once in a while I get in a mood to knit granny squares, and it was, one of those times. So I decided to do some really simple granny squares using a really fun yarn, which I forgot to mention last time when I was showing you the yarns my friend Itzel sent me from the US. She has sent me a very beautiful self-striping sock yarn from a Canadian dyer, Tiny Human Knits. It was a Halloween colorway. It was called the Usual Haunt, so it had some black and orange and blue, also a really fun panel of light speckled colors. I unfortunately didn't really feel the colors together. I don't usually use self-striping yarn for this exact reason. I want to be kind of in control of the color combos. I did something horrible to this yarn, so like trigger warning, I separated the colors when I was winding it into a cake. I literally cut into it and wound each of the colors separately, but this gave me so much freedom to mix them in a way that looks really appealing to me, because on their own the colors are so beautiful and they're just so wonderfully dyed. I really recommend this yarn if you can get your hands on it. So in the end I set aside the black entirely, and I would use it for a different project, probably a sock project later on, but it left me with these beautiful light colors, and this is what I came up with. So I was able to stretch it to 8 little granny squares, and as you can see I went around it to make it bigger using my precious Mondim yarn. I really love the colors together, and especially how this orange blends in with these speckled petals. I think it looks really, really beautiful, and it's destined to become either a small project bag for socks or just a little pouch with a zipper. But the reason I'm not finishing it yet is because I fear that I will have to actually frog back my progress and use the Mondim in the Rosie sweater, but at the same time I really don't want to do it, because these squares were actually attached together by my mom, who is a much better crocheter than me, so it has sentimental value to me and I don't really want to do it. So I'm not really sure how I'm gonna get out of this little pickle. I guess I will tell you next time, because I hope that by that time I will be able to finish at least the colorwork portion of my Rosie sweater, if not the entire thing. So I'll see how this whole situation turns out. I also wanted to show you my new project bags in which I've been keeping my current whips, and these are actually so beautiful, and they're my first kind of proper project bags, and these were kindly sent to me by my friend Yeva, who has a clothing brand in Lithuania, and she is actually a really talented knitter herself. When she started knitting, she kind of wanted to design the perfect project bag, and she has offered really, really generously to send me 2 of her bags, and this is a really fun padded one, which is kind of her medium bag, but it's still really big, and I keep my Rosie Sweater in here. And I also have a really fun, even larger tote bag in which I have been keeping my Heather sweater, which is still unfinished. I think this is really embarrassing. Since I last spoke to you, I only managed to finish the ribbing on the body, but I still need to do the other sleeve, and I have been stalling on this so badly and procrastinating so heavily because my boyfriend was away a lot these past 2 months. So I was, of course, justifying it by saying something like, he's not here to try it on, so there's no need for me to work on it now. I need to wait for him to come back. There's no need for him to try it on. I just need to do the exact same sleeve as the one I have already finished. But I think the real boyfriend curse is actually getting through a project for your boyfriend while you have, a lot of more appealing projects for yourself. I feel like we've come full circle with this project because it's going to be a Christmas gift yet again, because my new deadline is New Year's. I am really embarrassed about this, but I really want to have this finished, and I know I say it every time I show it to you, but it's true. But going back to the project bags, even though I was, of course, sent these, I think I would have bought them anyways because I wanted to have one for a long time, and I was kind of looking into buying one of these bags as a Christmas gift for myself, and I do really recommend them. They have like a million pockets, and they also don't need to be just a project bag. I think I will definitely use this one in the future as just a large travel tote bag, so I highly recommend them. I do have a code for 10% off, which is Andolini Knits 10, but this is not an affiliate code. I don't get any money from this. It's just a little something Yeva has offered in case you want to try these bags for yourself or get them as a gift for another knitter. And she also has smaller project bags and needle cases, and she has sent me a needle case for circulars, and I keep all of my Chaugos in there now. It's super convenient, and in general I feel really confident in recommending these to you because they're really good quality and pretty reasonably priced, and of course they're just gorgeous, so check them out if you want to. And Yeva has been a big supporter of my channel and a loyal viewer, so it feels really nice to be able to just give back a little bit and tell you about her designs. And the last work in progress I wanted to show you is a really fun project which I have started recently, but I think the next time you see me it will be all finished. So in my last podcast episode I mentioned that I had 2 different colored skeins of Purl Soho good wool and no idea what to use them in, and I had quite a few good suggestions in the comments, and a lot of people said that I can probably stretch this into a slipover. So one day I just couldn't rest until I found a perfect project to use this yarn in, and I treated this kind of like an art school assignment where I had some limitations, in my case when it comes to the meterage I had to use, and also I wanted to specifically find a garment project. So after a Ravelry advanced search, deep dive, and a lot of swatching, I decided that stripes would be fine, and this is how my Coco Vest was born. This is not a basic garment by any means, and I still am not really sure how I would style this, but it makes me so happy to see this come together. I really love fuchsia, and I think it contrasts so well with this cream color. Of course, this lighting doesn't do it justice, but believe me, it looks so much better in daylight. I can't really say that my vest is an accurate representation of the Coco Vest pattern, but it's a really good free pattern for a chunky vest, and I mostly used it as a guide for my stitch count and dimensions for my size, but still I really recommend it. So when I was swatching with this yarn, I tried to do some slip stitches to have these like blocky stripes, and also I wanted to use it on its own, but then I realized that I probably need to add some silk mohair to it because it will stretch my quantity longer. And then I remembered that I have some fuchsia silk mohair left over from my cloud sweater, which I knit back in spring, and it was pretty much identical in color to this fresh loganberry colorway, and I tried to make a swatch and I really loved it. And then I decided to try again and do a swatch using 2 strands of silk mohair held together with this yarn, and I loved it even more. So I quickly checked if this mohair was still available in the shop I initially bought it from, and thankfully it was. It was even the same dye lot, which is really great, and I bought 2 more balls, and this is Soft Dream from Yarna, which is a Ukrainian brand, and I don't really buy from Yarna anymore, but it's what I used originally in that cloud sweater, so I had to buy it again. And to the other colorway of good wool, which is this really nice creamy shade called Heirloom White, I just added some silk mohair I already had in my stash, and maybe they don't blend together as seamlessly as the fuchsia colorways, but I'm still really happy with my choice, and I was happy with the striped swatch I made, so I just dove into this project. So for the main fabric, I'm using 8mm needles, which is quite chunky for me. I don't get to use this needle size too often, and I went down in needle size quite significantly for the ribbing. I'm using 4.5. I just don't like the look of ribbing on chunky needles where it's like really open and see-through. And the smaller needle size also cinched in this armhole quite a bit, which I really liked because I was worried that it would be way too low on the finished vest. And knitting this vest has really reminded me of how tricky it is to knit on such a large gauge, because you basically don't have any space to hide any ends or mistakes or like color changes, specifically here because it's a striped vest. So for example, on the neckline here, I initially just picked up stitches in white from the main fabric and it looked really messy, so I could really see the individual stitches and like loops from which I picked up the collar stitches. So I frogged back and added a row of single crochets in white before I started to pick up the stitches, and I actually picked them up from this crochet border, so it has this like line in between the ribbing and the main fabric, and I really like this. I think it really brings the contrast together and makes it really elevated and not messy, because sometimes projects knit on larger gauges like this run the risk of looking really messy, especially if you're not careful about weaving in your ends or there are seams involved. But an upside of this good wool yarn is that it's of course 100% wool and non-superwash, so it can be spliced, which means I have less ends to weave in. And because I have this crochet border around the armholes and the neckline, I was able to hide some extra ends in there as well, so I think it looks really seamless on the inside. This vest is also really lightweight, but because of the two silk mohairs, it's still going to be really warm, and even if I don't find a suitable outfit to wear it with, I will be still really excited to wear it at home as a convenient warm layer. And I'm assuming that I will use up all of this white colorway, but I will have a lot left over of the fuchsia, so it's probably going to become a Sophie scarf depending on how much I have left, or maybe if I don't have that much of it left, I will just use it in a colorwork project down the line. At this point, all I have left to do on this knit is add a couple more stripes before I start to do the ribbing on the body, and then I just pray that it doesn't bleed when I block it. The swatches didn't really bleed, but because there's a lot more fabric and a lot more fuchsia here, I'm not really sure. I'll try to be as careful as possible and maybe add some vinegar to the water I'm gonna block it in, but we'll see how it goes. I'm just really excited to see how it comes out, especially since it was such an impromptu project and it's so different from the things I usually knit. I just feel like it was such a good way to kind of challenge myself and treat this as an assignment and try and find a solution to the limited amount of yarn I had. And just like that, it got dark at 3 p.m. so I had to turn the lights on, and I only have one thing left to talk about. It's actually something I would call a de-acquisition, because for the first time since I started knitting, I bought yarn and then returned it without knitting with it because I just didn't like it. So you might remember that in my fall knitting plans, I said that I really wanted to make the honeycomb vest, and I already had the yarn picked out for it. I wanted to use this Cascade 220 in this beautiful gray heathered color. It was unfortunately too thin to use for this pattern on its own, plus a lot of people mentioned that when you use Cascade 220 in a single strand, it tends to pill quite a bit, so I wanted to hold a silk mohair together with it, but I only had this cream colored mohair in stash that I'm now using for the Coco vest, so I decided to try and find a good gray silk mohair to hold together with it. And what really caught my eye in the local yarn store was Tynn silk mohair from Sandnes Garn in this beautiful tweedy colorway. It was a bit pricier than the other silk mohairs they had in the store, but I still was really excited about it because I thought that this tweed and these like little speckles of darker gray color would work really well and would not really distract from the cables. When I made a swatch with it, I realized that it's actually this type of tweed that I really dislike. So of course I don't really know what I'm talking about when it comes to technical terms, and I'm not really familiar with different methods of production for tweed, but I, in my experience, know that there are two types of tweed you can come across, and the one I really enjoy knitting with and wearing has all of the different specks of color and tweedy bits kind of spun tightly into the yarn itself, and it's really smooth. This is, for example, the type of tweed for this BC Garn Loch Lomond, which is my favorite tweed yarn and one of my favorite yarns in general, and it's really nice to work with. And unfortunately, this Tynn silk mohair was the other kind, the one I absolutely hate, where it kind of feels like somebody took an already produced yarn and just threw a bunch of trash into it. There's pretty much nothing holding the tweedy bits together with the yarn, so you can just easily pull them out with your fingers and they look like pills and not like actual tweed. And for example, on the Tynn silk mohair, the fluff is dark gray, so it truly looks like dust bunnies or fluff from like a vacuum or belly button fluff. It just looks, I don't know, really unappealing. So when I tried to hold it together with the Cascade yarn, I actually made a swatch. I noticed that whenever the tweed is, or like tweed actually pops up, it looks really messy, and again, like trash accidentally got knitted into the fabric. You can, for example, see it here on this little strand. It just looks like trash. I'm sorry. And I returned this yarn, and thankfully the store accepted it back. Vita from my local yarn store, who is a friend of mine, was really disappointed that I didn't like it, but didn't ask any questions because of course everybody's preferences are different. Maybe you've used it and you loved it, but I just really dislike this type of tweed, and I don't want belly button fluff in my project. I unfortunately wasn't able to start the Honeycomb Vest yet, so it kind of rolls over into my winter knitting plans, but I still want to have it eventually. I just didn't have the time. For now, I really want to get my whips under control and my plans as well, and I really don't like when knitting is stressing me out. I try to avoid that at all costs, so I'm gonna try and really slowly and calmly work through my projects and plans, and hopefully by the end of the year I will have it kind of under control more and wrap some things up. But I also have some fun acquisitions coming my way, and unfortunately my yarn ban was kind of broken for me, but once I show you these acquisitions in the next episode, you'll understand and agree with me that it's okay, but it's again gonna happen in the next episode. And for now, I think I'm gonna wrap this up. I just really hope that you enjoyed this video and found it to be interesting and fun even despite the technical setbacks. I really appreciate every single one of you. Please, if you like this video, give it a like and consider subscribing for more. I wish you happy knitting, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.